Hello, Sean here, and welcome back to the Bond in Context series, where I'm talking about the historical context of the James Bond movies. This is number 16, not counting the introduction, and we're on License to Kill, the second and last Bond film starring Timothy Dalton, which came out in 1989. This happens to be my second favorite Bond film. I absolutely love License to Kill, and I think it's one of the best films in the entire series. Now, I realize that's a controversial opinion. Many Bond buffs don't like this one very much, and it is different than what had come before and eventually the films that would come later. But I think it represents a high point in the series. It's also historically significant. License to Kill is the last Bond film made before the longest gap that occurred in the entire series, the longest gap between movies, 6 years, before the release of GoldenEye in 1995. As I'll explain in the next video, that 6-year gap happened to fall during one of the most momentous times in the entire 20th century. So License to Kill represents, in many ways, the end of an era. License to Kill is a very different Bond picture. For one thing, it's pretty detached from the Cold War and political context of most of the other Bond films, which are, after all, spy stories. Instead of spies or other political actors, Bond in this film delves into the world of drugs and drug trafficking. This isn't the first time that Bond has gone up against drug dealers. The chief villain of Live and Let Die in 1973, Mr. Big, was a drug dealer, and in the previous film from this one, The Living Daylights, a plot detail involved a shipment of raw opium from Afghanistan. But in License to Kill, the chief villain is a drug lord, Franz Sanchez, played by Robert Davi, who in my opinion is the best Bond villain in the entire franchise. Early in the picture, it's established that Sanchez presides over a criminal empire built mostly on cocaine trafficking that operates throughout most of Latin America. In the dramatic pre-credit sequence, Sanchez is captured by the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, with help from James Bond and Felix Leiter, who incidentally is played by David Hedison, who had also played Leiter in Live and Let Die. Sanchez escapes, of course, and comes back for revenge, killing Leiter's wife, and Bond resigns his commission in MI6 to go hunt him down for some much-deserved payback. This material is perfect for Timothy Dalton, who, as I said in the last video, interprets the Bond character as a cheerless nihilist, a bitter man who hates his job, but who is also fiercely loyal to his close friends. And Felix Leiter is about the only character in the entire series with whom Bond has any kind of lasting emotional connection, at least until M, as played by Judi Dench, starts to appear in the very later films. Sanchez is loosely based on a real person who was very much in the news in 1988 and 89. Pablo Escobar, the Colombian drug lord and head of the Medellin cartel, who operated in real life a vast and incredibly profitable criminal empire with exactly the same kind of reach and power that Sanchez is supposed to have in License to Kill. Escobar began running or smuggling cocaine into the United States in 1975, and at one point in the 1980s, he and his drug business is believed to have supplied 80% of all the cocaine that was brought into the U.S. Escobar eventually became essentially the shadow government of Colombia. His rise fueled an incredible wave of violence that made Colombia, for a time, the most dangerous place in the Western Hemisphere. Escobar even ran his empire from prison for a time. He was finally assassinated by a special team of Colombian National Police in 1993. Drugs were very much on the public mind in 1988 and 89. Although what we call the war on drugs was begun in the United States during the Richard Nixon administration, it greatly ramped up during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, particularly when a new form of cocaine called crack opened up new markets for drugs, especially in inner cities. Reagan and then his successor, the first George Bush, devoted lavish amounts of federal resources to intercede in drug trafficking. This was rather ironic, considering that the U.S. government had a love-hate relationship with drugs and drug trafficking in Latin America. In 1983, an officer in the Panamanian military, Manuel Noriega, came to power in a coup in Panama. Noriega was a valuable intelligence asset of the CIA, but he was also heavily involved in drug trafficking himself. The CIA knew this, but overlooked it given Noriega's loyalty and the strategic importance of Panama, whose canal the United States no longer controlled as a result of a treaty signed in 1979, giving the canal zone back to Panama. There are several layers of irony here, because in December 1989, just a couple of months after the release of License to Kill, President George Bush, again we're talking about George Bush I, decided on a U.S. invasion of Panama, contrary to international law, specifically to depose Noriega, who had become a political liability because of his ties to drug lords and also the brutal way that he treated his own people. While he was in power, Noriega also helped fund and organize a band of anti-communist guerrillas in neighboring Nicaragua, the Contras. The subject of the Contras came up in the last video. They were part of the extremely complicated scandal known as Iran-Contra, which broke in 1986 and 87, and threatened to overshadow the 1988 presidential campaign of George Bush, then vice president, as a Republican nominee. Bush continually had to dodge questions about his political involvement or his potential involvement in Iran-Contra, which remains unclear to this day. Bush did win the election, but the conservative Reagan era was, by 1988, basically running on fumes. Bush was unable to articulate any real policy vision or direction for the United States and campaigned basically as a caretaker president, essentially serving out Reagan's third term. This mirrors what ultimately happened to the conservative movement of Margaret Thatcher in Britain, who would be deposed in an intra-party election in November 1990. Her successor, John Major, although still a conservative, was more of a caretaker prime minister who served until the political winds shifted that brought Tony Blair on the scene in 1997. License to Kill reflects other elements that were in the cultural mind during 1988 and 89. Part of Sanchez's drug operation involves as a front a televangelist named Joe Butcher, who's played brilliantly by Wayne Newton. TV evangelism was very big in the news at this time, mainly as a result of high-profile scandals. Both Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Bakker, who were among the most popular evangelical preachers on American TV in the late 80s, both of them were brought down by sex scandals. Swaggart famously got on TV with tears streaming down his face and declared, "Lord, I have sinned." Bakker went to jail for financial corruption, and Swaggart ultimately faded into well-deserved obscurity. License to Kill is definitely a fun movie. The director, John Glenn, who directed every Bond picture made during the 1980s, has cited this as his best film. I believe it is. Clearly, it's the best of Dalton's two Bond pictures. A vocal minority of fans praise the film as one of the best all-time best in the series, and it's no secret that I share that opinion. I recall seeing the film when it came out in July 1989. It was one of the most fun times I ever had at the movies. Interesting bit of historical trivia connected to License to Kill. The Menendez brothers, Lyle and Eric, who murdered their parents in Beverly Hills on August 20th, 1989, bought tickets to a local multiplex to a showing of License to Kill, which they intended to use as their alibi. Just a heads up, although the next film in the Bond series is GoldenEye, the next video in the Bond in Context series is not going to be about that film. Instead, it's going to be about the gap, the major gap in time, 6 years between License to Kill and GoldenEye, during which the world changed immeasurably. I think we can't just jump into GoldenEye without understanding those immensely important changes. So join me in that video coming up soon. Thanks for watching.